We'll get going here. Hi, everybody. Well, welcome to the talk, and thanks for coming on this beautiful, beautiful day to hear a talk about climate change. So it's a good idea. I know some of you came with a friend, but it's a good idea to just keep in mind that having a buddy around is good when you're talking about climate change. I feel like either during the talk or afterwards, just because some of this stuff can be pretty heavy, and so you know. It's just good to sort of have somebody that you can talk to. So my name's Joe. I'm the local coordinator for Extinction Rebellion here in Chicago. I'm not a climate scientist, far from it. However, there is an environmental scientist in the room today, which makes me incredibly nervous. But I think the thing about climate change is that it sort of compels us to become kind of amateur climate scientists on some level, to try to wrap our brains around what's happening around us and to be able to synthesize it and make sense of it and do something with that. So with that said, I will hop into it. So with this talk, let me see if I can get it to work. All right. So I'm going to kind of lay it out like a story. And the story starts with my encounter with this bodhisattva called Manjushri. This is a sculpture of Manjushri wielding a sword in his right hand. Sometimes it's a her, but usually has a sword, and it's usually wielded. And that's because in Mahayana Buddhism, Manjushri is the bodhisattva of insight. And so the sword actually cuts through delusions and reveals the light of insight. And so I actually had a run-in, and the thing is, Manjushri can actually change forms into just about anything in your life. So if you're open to it, you can realize when you're kind of met with this bodhisattva or awakened being, right? So in my case, this bodhisattva was a 12-year-old girl who happens to be a student of mine. This is not her. This is a stock image, but it's kind of similar. And we'll call her Ellen. So Ellen came to me during a science class that I was teaching, and we were on break, and she had this burning question, I could tell. And a lot of the students see me as like the nature guy because I teach them how to grow food and about ecology. So she came to me and she said, "Is it true?" She said, "I heard on the news that because of global warming, everybody's going to die by 2070." Or maybe she said in 2070. It was very definite. And then she said, "Is it true?" Right? And we had covered some climate change stuff in our lessons, so she was sort of picking up bits and pieces of what we had talked about and picking up things that she'd heard in the news, and was sort of filtering that into her question, right? So as a teacher, like I get that kind of question, I sort of like take a breath, backpedal a little bit, think about like, is this going to get me fired if I say the wrong thing? Am I going to get a call from parents? So I said, well, not exactly. I said, it's not exactly true. I said, it's true that climate change is a big problem. And it's true that it's affecting people all over the world right now. And it's true that it's going to affect people even more in the future. And that there's going to be a lot of instability and a lot of suffering because of it. And I said, there already is. There's already, because I wanted to really acknowledge this child's intelligence, curiosity. So I said, like, yes, we can look around us and we can clearly see that there's a lot of suffering and that there will clearly be a lot more. But I said 2070 is that's a pretty hard line. That's a pretty definitive date. So let's not worry so much about the date, but let's focus on what's actually happening and what we can do. But see, the thing about Manjushri is that she doesn't just take the one answer and then go, okay, thank you for answering my question, and then like go off to do her own thing. She really wants to know the answer, right? So her rebuttal was, well, if you say there's going to be all this suffering and instability in the world, then why isn't everyone freaking out right now? Why isn't everyone freaking out? And so I gave her a kind of not satisfactory answer about why we can't freak out, or what freaking out could look like in terms of doing sustainability and a lot of the kind of like behavioral changes that we've been doing over the last 30 or 50 years. And she sort of shook her head, and I could almost hear her going like, adults, I swear. So that was my first encounter, and it kind of woke me up. I was already conscious of climate science and climate change, but it really woke me up to the kind of the immediacy of the concern. Because there's something about a child coming to you and looking you in the eye and saying, tell me the truth, I want to know. That kind of shook me up a little bit. So if we use this student's question as kind of our guide, then the first part of the talk is there a possibility of human extinction due to the climate crisis? And then the second part is going to be freaking out, or what to do about it. So as I mentioned before, grief is welcome. Something that Extinction Rebellion builds into our whole messaging is that grief is part of the way that we find power and we learn how to take action. And we can't do that unless we feel the grief. So just keep that in mind. All right, so one of the things that this student was basing her concern on was that she heard in the news that climate change was a really big deal. And the reason that she heard it in the news was probably because of the IPCC report that came out. It comes out every few years, and the last one was in 2015, I believe. And that IPCC report was really like this huge alarm bell to the entire scientific and sort of like conscious media scape. And it's a pretty good report. It's very thorough, it's very well vetted, it has a consensus of scientific agreement. And so that really made a lot of waves. However, the IPCC report has limits. Like I said, it has a lot of vetting. That means that the more it gets vetted, the more conservative it tends to be. So we can take the information that we get from it, but we have to realize that a lot of the more like hard-hitting observational data tends to get sort of weeded out to make sure that whatever's reported is absolutely, positively true without a shadow of a scientific doubt and cannot be challenged. Okay, the problem with it is many, and one of them is that observed climate science is very different from the kind of projections and modeling that the IPCC report uses. For example, Arctic sea ice, when you look at kind of the projected band of the decline of Arctic sea ice, when scientists actually do their observations out in the field, they say that it's very, very different. So the red line is this dramatic drop-off of Arctic sea ice that they're seeing. And so the big data, the big scientific consensus can't keep up with that kind of observation. There's another huge problem with the IPCC report. And that's called positive feedback loops. Positive feedback loops are not positive in the sense of like, yay, positive feedback loops. They're actually really, really bad. The idea being that in nature, in many different parts of the ecosystems, positive feedback loops reinforce themselves. So in this case, when we're talking about Arctic sea ice, when the temperature rises, that ice melts. When it melts, it turns into dark water. Dark water absorbs light and heat, right? Absorbs heat, and then it creates this cycle, this vicious cycle. So one of the scientists from the Yale Climate Center said that climate change is not simply a matter of cause and effect. It's more like a vicious cycle that just keeps causing and affecting. Scientists say that the retreat of the glaciers and disappearing sea ice both contribute to a feedback loop of warming, which is one of the factors contributing to Canada's disproportionate warming. This news I think this was last week that this just came out. The hard thing about doing these talks is like I'm constantly trying to keep up with news and add it to the talks, and like the amount of stories that come out every week is kind of intense. But just last week, in many articles, they reported that Canada's seeing like double the warming that other countries are seeing. And it's because of these vicious cycle positive feedback loops, right? Because of their proximity to these northern regions that should be covered by thick sheets of ice. And the report suggests that the majority of warming felt in Canada and around the globe is the result of burning fossil fuels directly. So we know that, right? So while we're talking about feedback loops, there's a lot of good evidence that things like the polar vortex that we experience in Chicago, now more increasingly, is related to those kinds of positive feedback loops. And if I can like put it into a nutshell, the way that I understand it is the Arctic air normally stays up in the Arctic, but because of the disturbance of the jet streams that kind of holds them up there, they basically get pushed down into what they call that bulge, right? And then we feel like we're in the Arctic, and meanwhile the Arctic air is like 30 or 40 degrees warmer than usual, so everything's kind of topsy-turvy. So again, this is not like definitive, all scientists are saying this. It's just like trying to grapple with why is this happening, right? Also, always good to point out when we talk about things like the polar vortex, we're not talking about weather patterns, right? We're talking about climate change in big systemic shifts. Another big gaping hole in the IPCC report is what's called permafrost. The fact that it doesn't include permafrost melting it's a glaring omission. So the thing about permafrost is, I mean, basically it's massive sheets of ice in the whole northern hemisphere, or the upper part of the northern hemisphere, that hold an incredible amount of carbon in the form of dead organisms in that ice, where it's just sitting there. But when it melts, it gets released. So in massive amounts. So this slide shows us that if we think about the total human emissions that are in the atmosphere right now, we're looking at 430 billion metric tons. But then we look at what's actually stored in the carbon, ready to be released. That's 1.4 trillion metric tons. And one estimate from 2012 said that 68 to 508 billion, a pretty big margin, is set to be released by the end of the century. So could easily double the amount of emissions that we've already put into the atmosphere just from that alone. The thing about permafrost is it comes in burps, right? So it's not like it just like sort of diffuses and is released slowly over time. It can get released in giant burps. And those burps are already at twice the rate predicted even 5 years ago. One research professor at the University of Alaska, Natalia Shashkova, said that a 50 billion ton burp of methane from thawing Arctic permafrost is highly possible at any time. A 50 billion ton burp at any time. And if it released 430 billion metric tons, that would be 12% of all human emissions occurring at once, right? So here's a little funny GIF. Some guys up in the Arctic and having a laugh. So that should be really, really concerning. And the fact that it wasn't included is troubling. Other hot news that just came out, there's this thing called the Doomsday Vault, or it's the Seed Ark, which is up in Norway. It's like a northern island off of Norway. So it's basically this vault that holds like all the genetic information that would like continue human civilization after an event. So it has all of the biodiversity that would be required. So this vault has always been thought to be in this impermeable fortress of ice. But now with this permafrost melting, they're seeing like it's not really threatened right now, but they're seeing that, oh, this thing that we thought was stable, this case of ice is now starting to change. And they're actually finding little bits of water condensing on the inside of the vault, which is concerning to the scientists that run it, because they didn't think that that could happen. In, forget the year, but 2018, so pretty recently, there was this paper called the Hothouse Earth paper that tried to basically like take all of these feedback loop effects and try to interrelate them and try to draw relationships between them. And this graphic kind of tries to draw a map of that. And so the thing about this graph is that it's really important to look at the levels of warming. So yellow is 1 to 2.9% or degrees Celsius, and then all the way up to red, which is above 5 degrees. And we're going to talk more about what those degrees of warming would actually look like on our planet. But you know, it's worth considering that we're already at 1 degree, so we're already seeing, you know, Greenland ice sheets are starting to deteriorate. Coral reefs are being bleached at rapid pace. So these things are happening. It's just how are they going to actually start to affect each other? And I don't think as humans we can even claim to thoroughly understand that or be able to predict it, but it's good to know that they're interrelated. So once these feedback loops are triggered, we have what's called runaway warming, right? Because just like the vicious cycle idea, when you have multiple vicious cycles that are all intertwining, you have what's called runaway warming, which means that it becomes more unstable and more unpredictable. One more thing I'll say about that. There was a scientist who shared the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1995, Mario Molina, who said the IPCC report demonstrates it is still possible to keep the climate relatively safe, provided we muster an unprecedented level of cooperation, extraordinary speed, and heroic scale of action. But even with its description of the increasing impacts that lie ahead, the IPCC understates a key risk, that the self-reinforcing feedback loops could push the climate system into chaos before we have time to tame our energy systems. And that the other sources and all the other sources of climate pollution. So that brings us to the Paris Accords in 2015. So this was like the world's best kind of effort at coming to some sort of like policy agreement globally. The problem with the Paris Accords is that not only were they not aggressive enough, but they're not legally binding, right? And you know, Trump famously pulled out of the Paris Accords recently, but it's not like anyone's holding him to it. or any country to it. And even the countries that are signed on to it aren't even meeting the standards that they set for themselves. So if we look at this graph, we can see the red line is basically the 3 degree Celsius rise that they set as their goal. Movements like ours, Extinction Rebellion, are more like the blue line. We're basically saying like, nope, time to shift down, all the way down, like now, like tomorrow. And then the white line is business as usual. So if we just continue doing what we're doing and burning fossil fuels at the same rate, we're set for 4 to 5 degrees Celsius by the end of, well, actually by 2030, 2050, something like that. So, how do we measure global warming? Just so we know kind of like how to talk about it, right? So it's important to understand this idea of a pre-industrial average. So the date kind of shifts a little bit, but it's basically before the Industrial Revolution, right? And we set the thermometer at 0 there, and we can use that as our baseline. So where are we today? Today we're at about 1.1 degrees Celsius, warmer than the pre-industrial baseline. And so basically what that means is that what we're seeing today, right? So we have hurricanes like Maria that's got a death toll that's something like 3,000. Heat waves recently in Australia that, you know, whole herds of livestock like these horses. Can't really tell what they are, but they're horses. You know, they bats falling out of the sky in Australia from heat. Then we have massive flooding in the coastal U.S. And increasingly, just recently, not just in the coastal U.S., but in the plain states in Nebraska. Massive flooding in Nebraska and Idaho and anywhere close to major rivers. So this gentleman right here, it's hard to see that image, but he's standing on his farm. His farm is in the background, covered in water. He's standing on the road. And then, of course, wildfires in California that are like the new normal is that they're like 50 times larger than they were just 5 or 10 years ago, right? And they used to say that that was abnormal, but now it's just normal. So while we're at this 1.1 degree Celsius, what if we stopped all emissions today? Like everybody in the whole world just said like, all right, we agree. We're going to switch to renewables. Tomorrow, no more emissions. Well, that would be great. And we want to do that. However, we need to be real about what that actually means. What it means is that we have to add up all these cumulative effects, right? So if we take the observed warming that we have now, which is 1.1 degrees, we add in like an average per decade increase of 0.2% or 0.2 degrees, and then something called the low-end aerosol effect, which is, every time I read about it, I think I understand it, but I don't quite. It's basically like aerosol is in the air from it's particulate matter from pollution, and it actually cools the earth a certain amount. But if we stop emitting tomorrow, we lose that effect, so then it warms it back up because aerosol is white colored, so it reflects heat. So we got to add that low-end aerosol effect. And then there's these unknowns, like positive feedback loops, like locked-in warming. So locked-in warming means that, and my friend Zach explained this to me the other day, that the carbon emissions in the air hang around for 10 to 40 years before they actually have an effect, right? So we have to sort of assume that there's just that waiting for us. So we're looking at like 1.8 plus some number, right? If we stop tomorrow. So let's just look at thinking back to that graph and like, what does 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees actually look like? There's this great book that just came out recently called The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. It's been getting a lot of really good press. And he does a good job of really going through and like, okay, let's look at what the world is going to look like. So we kind of have that in our minds. At 2 degrees Celsius, the Hothouse Earth authors call it the global tipping point. And currently, it's our best case scenario, by the way. So at 2 degrees Celsius, island nations will basically be not able to function if they're not covered in water. Air pollution effects alone would kill an additional 150 million people beyond what the air pollution does at 1.5 degrees Celsius. 150 million people is like, what is it, like 40 Holocausts or something like that? So the ice sheets would totally collapse. Water scarcity would be worldwide. Ocean acidity would increase by 30% by 2050. There would be 23 times the days of ocean heat waves. Than we have now, just heated water. The equatorial nations of the world would be virtually unlivable. Heat waves would be 5 times longer than they are now. And, just so we don't think that we in the US are sort of like insulated from all these problems, that we'd be one of the top 3 countries that would be predicted to be hit the hardest, especially in the desert states like New Mexico and Arizona. So then if we look at 3 degrees Celsius, which again, this is the Paris Accord goal that everybody sort of agreed on. So this is the most likely scenario given our current climate modeling. So we're looking at 41 times the days of ocean heat waves that we currently have. Also, add on to all that other stuff I said about 2 degrees, and I also add higher rates of like human behavioral stuff, like just violence, murder, domestic abuse, rape. We have to think about mental illness effects at those levels. So increased PTSD, ADHD, just mental illness in general. There's a lot of studies that have shown that the higher the temperature is in certain places, the higher the rates of mental illness and violence. Southern Europe would be in permanent drought. Wildfires would sextuple in size and frequency worldwide. So that's our current goal. And if we continue with business as usual, you can add on about $600 trillion in damages. The GDP of the world would be at least 20% smaller than it would be without climate change. Agriculture would probably be about half. It would be 50% less output than it is now, and the world population would be 50% more than it is now. Sea level rise would be about 8 feet. So there's a graphic of New York, basically mostly underwater unless they can build their levees high enough. Some places dealing with 6 natural disasters simultaneously. Droughts, disease, floods, wildfires, etc. Trying to manage all that at the same time. Cities in India will be unlivably hot most of the year. And refugees. So basically we're looking at about 100 million climate refugees by 2050. So just to give you some context, last year there were 14 million refugees from other things, right? So 100 million climate refugees by 2050. So that's business as usual. And then let's just keep going. At 6 degrees, which we basically have a 1 in 10 chance, the UN says, of meeting this 6 degrees Celsius mark. They predict twice as much global conflict as far as wars. Basically, at this level, somewhere between 4 and 6 degrees, the Arctic, the last time the Arctic was this hot, there were palm trees and tropical plants in the Arctic. There's a 11% chance that we would actually overshoot the 6 degree mark by 2100, says the UN. So again, it's a 1 in 10 chance. So it's like, I mean, compare it to like, would you get on a plane if it had a 1 in 10 chance of crashing? Probably not. And basically there's not really any hope for current civilization as we currently know it. And then the UN's worst case scenario is 8 degrees Celsius of warming. They say it's unlikely, but it's still within the realm of possibility. So the oceans would swell 200 feet higher than current levels. Very little land could actually produce any food, and fires and storms would be unimaginably catastrophic and frequent. Again, unlikely, but still factored in. Okay. Oh, my memory is terrible. So we were talking about climate refugees. So in last year alone, there were 68.5 million refugees from war, famine, in total. But because of climate change, they're predicting 140 million by 2050 additional, right? So then you just scale that up. Like this is like a picture that's supposed to be like 10,000 Syrian refugees. Just like imagine 100,000 refugees and the kind of stress that that puts on all of our systems. So farming is definitely going to be hit hard. So like this guy told The Guardian, when I was a kid, my dad said that an inch of rain was good rain, and that's just what we needed. Now we get 4, 5, 6 inches of rain in one sustained wet spell that lasts 2 or 3 days. I don't ever remember that as a boy. I've never seen the sustained wetness in the land that we have now. It's become an almost annual assault on our ability to produce crops. He's in Missouri. We should also think about what's often called eco-fascism. So the idea that as the ecosystems go into chaos, like fascism basically just kind of swoops in and fills those power vacuums, right? So we can ask ourselves, are we already seeing early signs of fascism? Disdain for human rights, supremacy of the military, rampant sexism, controlled mass media, obsession with national security, religion and government are intertwined, corporate power is protected. So it's hard for governments to maintain some kind of peaceful order when there's so much stress on these ecological systems. There's this guy, Kevin Anderson. He's kind of one of the main voices on climate change policy. So in his eyes, there's a widespread view that that higher than 4 degrees future is incompatible with organized global communities. So we could say extinction is a possibility, or we could say it's a probability. During the 4th and 5th mass extinctions, otherwise known as the Permian-Triassic extinctions, the carbon levels were actually like pretty close to what they are now in the atmosphere. It was 248 million years ago. But of course they were caused by volcanoes and other kinds of carbon. But it's pretty widely believed that we're already kind of in the midst of the 6th mass extinction right now. So given all that, scientists Like my friend Zach here, he likes to say that we like to employ the precautionary principle, right? It's like, if we know all this information, how do we move forward in a way that we're basically safeguarding our futures and the future generations? Like the frog in the boiling water. If you tell the frog that it should get out, and the frog speaks English, then it should get out. I don't know, it's a bad example, but. So the risk levels are known. We know that 1.5 is dangerous. We know that 3 degrees Celsius is catastrophic, and we know that 5 degrees is unknown, beyond catastrophic, as they say. That means we have a 1 in 20 chance that the current level of carbon in the atmosphere could cause human extinction, and is causing the extinction of over 200 other species every single day, right? So knowing those risks, how do we proceed? You know, that's our question. Our other question is, who's going to save us? The politicians will not save us. Our beloved Democrats have put forward their own Green New Deal, which basically excludes a lot of the effective parts of the Green New Deal. And some of them even voted against it in the last hearing that they had. All Republicans voted against it. This guy, what's his name, who Trump just put in as the, thank you, Happer. He's like the climate change guy in the Trump administration. He basically is insane and says that carbon molecules should be regarded similar to the way that we think of the Jews during the Holocaust, that they should be, that they are being persecuted against. And that carbon is actually good for the world, that we need to value the effects of carbon in the atmosphere. That's his stance on it. Then we've got locally our Governor Pritzker, right? So Pritzker signed this pledge called the U.S. Climate Alliance. Pledge is basically like a state-by-state agreement that says, even though the feds aren't doing anything about climate change, we as Illinois are going to sign on to this agreement, and we're going to abide by the Paris Accords. Again, like, whoop-de-doo, thanks, setting us up for 3 degrees of warming. However, politicians like Pritzker are billionaires, and they're billionaires because they have a lot of holdings in fossil fuel interests all over the world. And that's been documented, whether he knows it or not. Right? So how do you work with those conflicts of interest? How do you actually make radical change? Voting will not save us. Big oil gets a 5,800% return on every dollar they spend in Congress. We know that most politicians spend more time talking to lobbyists and raising money than they do actually writing policy. And it works really well. Gerrymandering is obviously a huge problem. Even if we vote, oftentimes the popular vote doesn't really mean anything. The voting zones are constantly gerrymandered to keep this sort of status quo going. So it's good to vote, but it's not going to save us. Sustainability will not save us. I work with children and teach them how recycling is important and composting is important and not wasting food is important and being efficient is important, but it's just not working. And if we're not being honest about that, then we aren't teaching the right things. All of our paper doesn't get recycled anymore. Something like 7% of plastic gets recycled. Almost half of our food gets wasted. And marine life is washing up on the shores full of plastic. And we're not saying don't do those things. We're just saying, let's be real. Knowledge will not save us. Since Al Gore, right? Did the what was it called? Inconvenient Truth. Our emissions have skyrocketed, like just pedal to the metal. Total emissions between only 2009 and 2018, only 9 years, was 22% of overall emissions in the world. Like, clearly the knowledge that we're doing harm is not helping us. The rich will not save us. In fact, they will find these luxury survival bunkers that are being built all over the world, like real things, and try to reserve one. And then there's this great article that I won't quote from because I don't want to take time, but this article, Survival of the Richest, is amazing. This tech person was invited by a bunch of sort of billionaire stakeholders to this retreat where he thought he was going to be talking about internet security or whatever, and they were basically saying, no, what we really want to know is when the event happens, how long do we have without money? Is Bitcoin going to be a thing? How do we keep our workers loyal to us without money, right? It's an active preparation for this kind of thing. It's not a paranoid delusion. So that brings us to the idea of hope, right? So what we need right now is not hope. And no diss on Obama and the hopey, changey politicians, but it's not what we need right now. We need courage. And there's this climate scientist at NASA, Kate Marvel. She has a great TED Talk. But she says, and I quote, "To be a climate scientist is to be an active participant in a slow-motion horror story. We are inevitably sending our children to live on an unfamiliar planet. As a climate scientist, I am often asked to talk about hope. Particularly in the current political climate, audiences want to be told that everything will be all right in the end. Climate change is bleak, the organizers say. Tell us a happy story. Give us hope. The problem is, I don't have any." Hope is a creature of privilege. We know that things will be lost, but it is comforting to believe that others will bear the brunt of it. But the opposite of hope is not despair, it's grief. Even while resolving to limit the damage, we can mourn. And here, the sheer scale of the problem provides a perverse comfort. We are in this together. The swiftness of the change, its scale and inevitability, binds us into one, broken hearts trapped together under a warming atmosphere. We need courage, not hope. Grief, after all, is the cost of being alive. We are all fated to live lives shot through with sadness and are not worth less for it. There's nothing wrong with this. Courage is the resolve to do well without the assurance of a happy ending. So like in the IPCC reports, one of the statistics was that we have a 5% chance of actually making the changes that the report puts forward, necessary to save civilization. 5% chance. So that's doing well without the assurance of a happy ending, right? These are photos from Tangier, Virginia, which is kind of a case study for sea level rise. It's a fishing town. Basically, the children like play in like what used to be their parks are now like under a few feet of water. This is by a photographer, James Balog, who he has a great film called The Human Element. But So the question is, what do we do, right? When we're thinking about the future. So how do we sort of like look at what's happening and where do we find strength, you know? So shifting gears a little bit, where I find strength is in my kids. And you might not be family people, you might not be parents, but as a parent, like, it's just easy for me to look at my kids, and that's where I find my strength. That's where I find like a reason to want to look at things with honesty and with openness and try to figure out a way to move forward. My son Bailey, he can tell the difference between crunchy snow and soft snow. He can hear it with his ears. And he can also hear the difference between trees in Chicago and trees in Seattle. And I like to think that when he's my age, in 40 some odd years, he'll hear the cries of the world, you know? And I want him to have the tools when he hears the cries of the world to know what to do with that energy. So, what do we do? Not our saviors, but what do we do when our government is actively leading us towards societal and ecological collapse and ensuring the deaths of billions of humans? Or to quote the Bodhisattva Manjushri, why isn't everyone freaking out? So, in Extinction Rebellion, we say hope dies and action begins. So we lose the hope idea and we start acting. We say rebel for life because the life that we have right now, it's not only the life that we're trying to protect in the future, it's like, how do we actually build a new way for people to relate to each other right now? Because again, 5% chance. We are not holding on to this big idea that we're going to win some utopic thing. But in the process of doing this, we're relearning how to be human beings with each other in a way that's not completely defined by capitalism and emissions. So, we need to put our bodies upon the gears. To quote Mario Savio during the lead up to the Vietnam War, there's a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at your heart that you can't even take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies on the gears and upon the wheels and upon the levers, on all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all. And to do that kind of work, we have to do what Einstein said, and we have to get out of our comfort spot, the comfortable spot that keeps us sort of away from things that we're fearful of. Einstein said the world is a dangerous place to live, not because of the people who are evil, but because of the people who don't do anything about it. So we can look at examples of mass mobilization that's required for something like this, and really the only thing that even comes close is World War II and kind of the rallying that our country went through around then. So if we could rally in a similar way that we did in World War II, we could avoid 150 million excess premature deaths by the end of this century from air pollution, which again is the equivalent of 25 Holocausts, or twice the number of deaths in World War II. And that's if we could limit the average amount of global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we're at 1.1 right now. So that's why Extinction Rebellion is saying tomorrow, or preferably today, we need to put our bodies upon the gears and make it stop. So other examples we look at are various types of nonviolent civil disobedience. Martin Luther King said, an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and who willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of a community over its injustice is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law. And it's really important to keep in mind that when movements like this were happening, they were not popular in the way they are now, you know. Schools celebrate MLK Day and we read his speeches and we revere that time, but at the time, these were not popular things. I mean, they were being spit on and bricks thrown at their heads, and of course we know all the racism that's behind that, but we need to realize where we are right now and what needs to happen. Direct action works. Gandhi, somebody tried to tell me recently that Gandhi was really good at holding meetings, and that's why we should look up to him. But it's not true. He was actually obviously an icon of nonviolent civil disobedience, and he managed to liberate India from the colonial rule nonviolently. It can work. Nelson Mandela. You could look at something stateside like the United Auto Workers strike in Detroit. Unions are a huge part of this movement, in fact. And young people are doing it right now, with or without the help of adults. Inspired by Greta Thunberg in Sweden, who incredibly, with a singular voice and speeches that cut through the nonsense, she's able to inspire tens of thousands of young people to skip school and to basically demand that they actually have a future to live in. So we are in complete solidarity with that movement. There's a really important study. I'm going to try to zip through this. There's a really important study by this scientist, Erica Chenoweth, who basically looked at all these nonviolent movements, and she tried to come up, hi Bailey, she tried to come up with some kind of number, like an equation, to figure out how many people do you actually need to succeed. And first, they looked at movements and said, it's 5%. You need 5% of any population to actually enact systemic change. But when they really got down to the nitty-gritty of what made these movements work, it was 3.5% of the population. So the question is, how many of us in this room are part of that 3.5%? In Chicago, that's like 80,000 people, which is daunting, but I like to think that if 80,000 people heard this talk, they might be compelled to do something. And we can forget about political polarization and ideology. Historically, John Locke, who was a liberal, he termed what political philosophers call the right to revolution. When a government fails to protect the lives and livelihoods of its citizens, as in the case of climate change now, the people have a right to rebel. And then on the other side of the aisle, Thomas Hobbes, a conservative, spoke of the social contract, where the state derives and loses its authority based on its willingness to and ability to maintain order and security for its people. Our man Thomas Jefferson, he was not perfect, but he did say that we hold these truths to be self-evident, and that all people are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. We could probably all just say that right now. And then he went on to say that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government. That part doesn't get said a lot. And if we're not in the middle of a government becoming destructive of our ends, then we don't even know what that means. They're just empty words. He also said, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government and provide new guards for their future security. And it wasn't that long ago that he said that. And we already have the solutions, technologically speaking, we just don't have the political will, right? So the only thing I need to explain on this slide is that there's studies that say that if cattle, like we don't have to become vegan tomorrow, it'd be nice, but if cattle would just eat like half of their feed in seaweed instead of soy and corn, we could reduce emissions by like 70% because of big ag. And because cows emit a lot of methane, and when they eat seaweed, they emit less methane. So what we need to do here, what Extinction Rebellion is trying to do, is we're trying to shift the Overton window. I don't know why it's called the Overton window, but it's a cool idea that we're basically in this place where acceptable dialogue is way, way, way shifted to the right. And we've got these polar extremes where you've got like the Occupy movement, or like that's kind of dated, so now we could say the Green New Deal is like way on the left, and like the Muslim ban is way on the right. We need to shift the window way over so that ideas like a wall on the southern border never even pass the bar where somebody blurts it out of their stupid face. We have to push it physically, right? So I'm going to give a real brief overview of Extinction Rebellion, and then I hope that you will join us. So it basically started maybe a year ago by this guy Roger Hallam, a little over a year ago. And he was a student at King's College in London, and he and his students were trying to convince the college to divest in their fossil fuel interests. And they met with them, and they deliberated, and they negotiated, and that went on for 2 years, and nothing happened. And then he started doing direct action. Spray chalking, walkouts, strikes, blockades, locking himself to things. It took 6 weeks of doing that, and the university said, okay, you've made your point. We're embarrassed. It created a crisis within the university that they didn't have much of a choice, because they didn't want to see it get worse. Direct action works. Not much later, Extinction Rebellion did one of the first big actions in London in November of last year, and they blocked all the major bridges in London simultaneously with what's called swarming. So they had already amassed like 6,000 members by that point in London. So on the left is normal traffic, on the right is what the blockage looked like after swarming. And the organizers now are saying that during this international week of rebellion that's coming up in April, they're planning big things to basically shut down the entire transit and economic system in the UK. They've done things like occupying the BBC to demand that the BBC actually reports accurately on climate change and divests from their fossil fuel interests that are keeping them from actually reporting accurately. They've pressured big governments like London and Bristol to declare what's called a climate emergency. And there's a lot of other smaller cities in Europe that are doing this as well. And when a city declares a climate emergency, it basically sets into motion a lot of policy that couldn't happen without that declaration, right? There's a wide range of types of actions that are happening by Extinction Rebellion. On the left is just classic blockade. This is a government building. They are superglued to the building. Their hands are superglued to it. And then just last week, I guess, some members stripped down during a parliamentary discussion over Brexit, and they superglued their butt cheeks to the glass. And another big action that happened recently was called the Blood of Our Children. So they actually poured fake blood all over the on Downing Street. Visceral, visible, emotive, impactful, not easy to mix the message. Extinction Rebellion has expanded to something like 35 countries now, probably more since this map was made, but it's really, really growing fast. And that's because we organize by what's called momentum-driven organizing. So we're not like stopping to say like, okay, where are we at? And are we meeting our goals? And do we have the approval of the head office before we go and block this bridge? Not at all. In fact, as long as you're abiding by nonviolence and certain principles, you just do it. And that's what gets people interested in wanting to join and do more. So there's some basic fundamentals of Extinction Rebellion. Basically, the fundamentals are that the government's right to rule is based on a social contract through which people sacrifice liberty in return for protection. The government has broken this social contract by leading us into climate doom, and we have a duty and a right to rebel. We do not think that the system as it exists today is capable of taking the necessary action, and we will put pressure on the government through acts of nonviolent civil disobedience. We have basic demands. There's 4 demands in the States, and there's only 3 currently in the UK. That's because we added this 4th demand that emphasizes a just transition that prioritizes the most vulnerable, especially the indigenous people of our country and people of color and poverty, poor people, marginalized people. But essentially, we're saying zero emissions need to be happening in about 9 years. Okay, so again, like I said, as long as you adhere to basic principles like a strict non-negotiable commitment to nonviolence and a commitment and respect for and inclusion for all people of all abilities and races and sexual persuasions, then you can take action in the name of Extinction Rebellion. Another way that we can move pretty quickly is that we don't operate as a hierarchy, we operate as a holacracy. So if you picture just like cells of people in working groups that don't have to be necessarily in contact with the other cells or with the larger organizational body, then they can go ahead and do actions. There's many different ways to take on a role. It's not like you have to necessarily super glue your butt cheeks to something, but we are looking for people who are willing to do those kinds of things. But there's a lot of different ways to get involved. Here in Chicago, we're very, very aggressively trying to recruit to grow the numbers, and we haven't even started talking about fundraising yet. We're too busy trying to plan actions, and actions are the way that you grow the numbers quickly. So in the US, there's a lot of chapters, something like 40 or 50 chapters now. Seems like there's a new one every day. Some of them are just now having their first meetings, and some of them are doing really cool actions like in New York back in January, some activists disrupted the Rockefeller Center and got arrested for it. Probably just like a misdemeanor for disorderly conduct, something like that. So this guy scaled this statue They're starting to see some press like Rolling Stone and other mainstream media in the States starting to pick it up. We have to be clear that the media is actually one of our targets as well, because it's great if they think that Extinction Rebellion is cool and is like a neat movement to talk about, but they need to do their part and really tell the truth about climate change in a way that is on the front page every single day. You know, if it's not, then what are we doing as human beings? So we started in January as well with pretty like lighthearted action at the Polar Plunge, which is where people jump into the lake in the middle of the winter. And we basically were in solidarity with them and saying that we said, enjoy the winter while you can. Thanks to climate change, our kids won't have a snowball's chance in hell unless we rebel. We furthered our kind of outreach campaign at St. Paddy's Day and dropped some really big banners and shared flyers that basically, again, showed solidarity with our Extinction Rebellion members in Ireland who are really experiencing a lot of really horrendous climate change effects now, and threatened to take away people's beer if they don't do something about it. It was a lot of fun, actually. So, like I mentioned, beginning April 15th is the International Day of Rebellion, International Week of Rebellion through April 22nd. Chapters all over the world are planning all types of disruptions. And it's a great time to get involved. Here we're doing something on the 15th, which is a Monday. It's tax day, as it turns out. Called Extinction Wake Up. It's going to be downtown at the Thompson Center, which is our state building, from 3 to 5 p.m. So we're spreading the news about that. And in addition to that action that's planned during that week, we are holding trainings on nonviolent direct action coming up soon. As well as all of our outreach events, fundraisers, etc. So our lives have meaning when we follow our conscience and we're willing to make sacrifices to protect what we love. We ask others who feel the same way to join our peaceful rebellion and rebel for life. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the time. Thank you.